This video is going to cover the grammar from chapter 32 of Ecce Romani, which is forms of the perfect passive tenses. And this is on pages 42 and 43 in your books if you're following along. Here's a chart that we saw a couple chapters ago in chapter 30. This was on page 24 of our books, and this was the passive system of the present family. So you can see here the present tense, the imperfect tense, and the future tense for our four verbs, one from each conjugation, our model verbs. And again, we looked at this at length, but basically the same thing was done for each tense. It was a stem, and then a vowel, and then maybe some other stuff, and then our passive endings, are, ris, tur, mur, mini, untur. So we used this chart, and we did a lot of practice with this, so we could very well understand those three different tenses in the passive, whether something is done, was being done, or will be done. But we know there are more than just three tenses. There are actually six. These three belong to that present family, but what about the perfect family? That's what we want to look at in chapter 32. So here's a chart. It takes those four verbs and arranges them a little differently, so it arranges them by principal parts. Obviously, each verb, each regular Latin verb, has four principal parts. That chart we saw just a few seconds ago from chapter 30 deals with these first two principal parts. They are again called that present family, and we use these two principal parts to get stems, to get vowels, and then we add those endings like we saw from the chart. Now what we want to do is move on to the perfect family, the other two columns there. The third column, the third principal part, that's going to be our perfect active system. So we know, based on Latin 1, that if we take the I off of any third principal part, we can then make the perfect tense, the pluperfect tense, or the future perfect tense for that verb by adding various endings. Well, all of those are active. The perfect active, the pluperfect active, and the future perfect active. So for our purposes in this chapter, we're going to ignore the third principal part, and we're going to move on to the fourth principal part, which is called the perfect participle passive. The key word there, passive. This is how we're going to make the passive forms in the perfect family. Notice all four of these principal parts, portatus, motus, missus, and auditus, end in us. So hopefully that should be recognizable to you, us as in us, ending, 2, 1, 2 adjective endings. That's going to be very important for what we're going to do coming up. So let's see how this works. Let's start with just the first conjugation verb. And again, to make the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect passive forms, we're going to start with that fourth principal part. And it looks like this. That first bullet point at the bottom, to make these forms, we use the fourth principal part plus a form of the verb to be. So there's two words that make one form. Let's call that a combo, because if you've ever been to the Jewel, you buy combos. There are two things in one, right? Well, here we go. Also, two things in one, the fourth principal part, and then a form of the verb to be. So on this chart, that first column is the perfect passive, and we have portatus, or portata, because us, masculine, feminine. We'll revisit that in a few minutes. And then sum. So the perfect passive is going to use sum and then s, portatus or portata s, and then portatus est. When we get to plural, we know the form is summus for the verb to be, but portatus is singular, isn't it? So that's why on this chart it's instead portati, because that long I is a plural ending. So portati summus, portati estis, portati sunt. So that's our first, second, third, singular and plural forms in this perfect passive tense. That would be translated as was carried. So portatus sum, I was carried. Portatus est, you were carried. Portatus est, he was carried. Portati summus, we were carried. Portati estis, y'all were carried. Portati sunt, they were carried. If we move on to that next column, the pluperfect passive, look at that. Notice the only thing that has changed is instead of sum as est, summus estis sunt, now we have eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. So we're using the imperfect tense of the verb to be, and when we combine that with the fourth principal part, we get the pluperfect passive, had been carried. So portatus eram, I had been carried. Portatus eras, you had been carried, and so on and so forth. Moving on to that last column, the future perfect passive, we should hopefully see what's coming by now. Since it's future perfect, we need the future tense of the verb to be. So ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritis, erunt. Portatus ero, I will have been carried. Portatus eris, you will have been carried. All the way down to portati erunt, They will have been carried. So as you're looking at this chart, it kind of looks like a lot. There's a lot of words here, a lot of verbiage, but it's actually pretty simple. We're using this fourth principal part of the verb to be, or of a verb, and then we add on to that as a separate word of some form of the verb to be. In the perfect passive, we use the present tense. In the pluperfect, we use the imperfect tense. And in the future perfect, we use the future tense. So it's actually really, really straightforward. Let's look at another conjugation to see how this works. Our second conjugation verb, moveo, movere, movi, motus, which means move, our fourth principal part is motus, again ending in us. So that gives us these forms: motus sum, motus est, motus est, moti sumus, moti estis, moti sunt, for that perfect passive. And this would be translated was or were moved. I was moved. You were moved. He was moved. We were moved. Y'all were moved. They were moved. In the pluperfect, the only thing we do is we change out the present tense of the verb to be to the imperfect. Eram, eras, erat, eramos, eratus, erant. And now our translation, since it's pluperfect, we still need the word had in there, but it's passive. So had been moved. And then the future perfect, instead of eram, eras, erat, it's the future of the verb to be, ero, eris, erit, erimos, eritis, erunt. And our translation then becomes will have been moved. And you can see in there, there's the future, will, and the perfect passive, have been, and moved, again, also passive. So this is what a second conjugation verb would look like in this perfect family. Notice how regular it is. Just like in the perfect active family, there's no vowels we have to worry about, no different sets of endings depending on conjugations. Everything is the same, which is really nice. It makes things a whole lot easier. Third conjugation, mitto, mittera, misi, missus, is our fourth principal part. Again, the us ending is going to be changeable. So missus sum, missus est, missus est. Missi sumus, missi estis, missi sunt is was or were sent. Missus eram, eras, erat, eramos, eratus, erat, had been sent. That's the pluperfect passive. And then missus ero, eris, erit, missi erimos, eritis, erunt, future perfect passive, will have been sent. Hopefully you're getting the hang of this by now, so we can move a little quicker through these. Fourth conjugation. Audio, audire, audivi, auditus. Us, auditus. So that gives us these forms. Auditus sum as est, auditi sumus estis sunt is was or were heard. Auditus eram, and so on, is had been heard. And then auditus ero, will have been heard. So obviously, what's very important here? Well, we need to know all four principal parts of a verb. We also need to have a firm grasp of the different tenses of the verb to be, so we can align them with the perfect, the pluperfect, or the future perfect passive, so that we get the right form. So the perfect passive. Anytime we want to make it, it's going to be the fourth principal part of a verb plus the present tense of esse. So there are a couple examples here below that. Portatus sum, I was carried. Now the us ending, we mentioned this a few minutes ago, the us can obviously change to be any one of the forms on an adjective chart. So it makes sense that that's going to agree with the subject. That next sentence, puer portatus est, means the boy was carried. Puer is masculine, so I need a masculine ending on portatus. That's different from the one below that, puella portata est. The girl was carried. Girl obviously is feminine, so I wouldn't say puella portatus est. It has to be puella portata est, and the a ending there because puella is feminine. Does that make sense? It should, hopefully. These endings have to agree. We've seen that over and over and over again in Latin, so it shouldn't be any surprise that endings are agreeing here. The pluperfect passive, like we saw in the charts, is going to be the fourth principal part plus the imperfect tense of esse. So portatus eram, I had been carried. Puellae portatai erant, the girls had been carried. So puellae is feminine plural, so I put a feminine plural ending on portatai erant. So that's a pluperfect passive, the girls had been carried. Finally, future perfect passive is again going to be the fourth principal part plus the future tense of esse. Portatus ero means I will have been carried. Domum portati eritis means y'all will have been carried home. So portati tells us it's plural. It also tells us that this you all is masculine. If it was feminine, it would be something like portatai eritis. But portati, you all will have been carried home. That's a future perfect passive. So to generalize, the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect passive all follow the same pattern of taking the fourth principal part, also known as the PPP, perfect participle passive, and a form of the verb to be. And this is called a combo. The PPP ending is going to agree with the subject in gender and number. Puer laudatus est, puella laudata est. Again, like those sentences we just saw. For some more practice, try exercises 32B and 32C on page 44, and we'll talk about this more in class as well.